Welcome to the reality show. I am joined by Marco and Richard. Today we are discussing should Israel kick the BBC out of the country? Now we'll broaden it out to other news outlets that are actively and openly hostile to Israel. But yeah, I think I'll get to it in a moment. I did want to say something that I forgot to mention in my news update on the Daily Objective, which is CNN was reporting that there are a large number of tanks moving into Gaza, like significantly larger than before. I don't know how verified this is. I my distrust for news sources, especially non-Israeli ones, is not limited to the BBC. It does extend to. I don't think CNN is as nearly as bad. But there's a lot of room from bad to BBC on this topic. So CNN is somewhere in that space. But yeah, so that could be good news. I've also read that they're moving in on Gaza City. So will which is where that's where the magic happens, so to speak. So yeah, hopefully something is coming, something bigger than what we've seen before, and yeah, hopefully justice is on its way to Gaza City. All right, now this topic came from the fact that in Israel there have been discussions from the start, uh, from the start of the war about Al Jazeera's reporting. Al Jazeera is, of course, the Qatari government um, uh, news outlet. It is, it's owned and run by the dictatorial government of a country that isn't officially but should be designated an enemy of Israel and of the rest of us here in the West. Um, and of course, they're reporting, they report from Jerusalem. It says, from occupied East Jerusalem. They're incredibly hostile. They, of course, publish everything that Hamas says as if it's fact. But the BBC does that as well, and it does that in English. And the BBC is tricky because officially, the UK is an ally of Israel. And it's the BBC is a government news outlet, but it's not. Rishi Sunak doesn't call the editor and tell him what to put on the channel. So Marco, Richard, you've both lived in this country longer than I have, so I will defer to you. I mean, let's generally talk about the BBC and then figure out what if anything should Israel do on this.
Well, first of all, Israel right now is in a state of war. So it's in its right to kick out any news organization they want. You wouldn't expect them to support somebody who tells the enemy what the plans are, what the movement are. So a kind of blanket pause on reporting is perfectly legitimized and legal on their side. Now, whether that's going to make any difference whatsoever, to be honest, because they are surrounded by a different faction of degrees of savages. Oh God! And so to be honest, in terms of reporting news that would broadcast the propaganda of Hamas, I don't think that would solve any problem whatsoever. Now, the BBC has got one of the biggest news agencies, news sections it's got is the BBC World, which covers news from all over the world. And it's not the first time that associates people who were freelance for them on the Middle East reporting have been actually being kicked out and effectively there's an inquiry about their behavior because they've been found posting anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic stuff all the time. That happens in the past, way before the 7th of October. It's happened again on the case of now to people. So, yes, I mean, add that to the fact that Mossad is now in Qatar talking to the Qatari, it's like, well, kicking out Al Jazeera is not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I would say about the BBC is the BBC isn't an ally of the UK, let alone of Israel, and that's half the problem. The BBC is also it's statist. Now that doesn't mean the same thing as it supports the current government or the state as it is right now, but it is always pro statism. It's pro more taxation, more regulation, more control, more money, all of that. So it views everything through that lens. Basically, if you imagine left-wing academics going to often the top universities, coming out and wanting to change the world based on their lefty academic studies, would sum up what the BBC is. So it is different to other places. It's different to CNN, although it shares some traits. And you see some of those things with its war reporting. I mean, well, we can get onto the war reporting now if you like, or if you want to pass on to John first and come back, that's fine.
Yeah, John. So you're not being taxed to pay for the BBC. Congratulations. I don't know if you're watching any of their coverage. I accidentally watched like 15 minutes of their coverage a couple days ago. It was just on and I couldn't stop, although I was really disgusted. But yeah, have you seen any and what do you think? How do you think this idea of potentially not allowing them to operate within Israel, is that violation of free speech and freedom of the press?
No, I really haven't been watching any of their stuff. I'm having a hard time keeping up with everything. Just the ARC videos alone are keeping me busy. But the only news I watch daily, regular news, is NBC, just to keep up with what that side is saying and things like that. But yeah, I think Israel in this case has a right to kick them out, either Al Jazeera or BBC, but I don't think they will do that with the BBC because they want to maintain friends, I'm sure, with the UK as much as it's fake, as fake as it is. But it's an emergency situation. They actually declared war. I think it's a legitimate war power to have, within reason. And it sounds like this is well within reason from the language they use. It's just disgusting from any Western source, in my opinion, even the ones that claim to be pro-Israel. So I don't know, but I don't know if it's going to make much of a difference, in the propaganda machine, because half the West is spreading the propaganda of Hamas. So if anything, it's kind of a gesture of strength if they do it, but I just don't see it happening. If they can't even do it to Al Jazeera.
Yeah, you mentioned, basically getting in trouble with the UK. Richard, to what extent is that an issue? How do you think the UK government would react? And also, you wanted to comment on the BBC's specific coverage of this war.
Yeah, on the coverage of this war, I mean, just wanted to say about war reporting to start with. I mean, war reporting is hard in the first place, and not just because of the danger to journalists and that kind of stuff, even though there are plenty of examples of BBC journalists and other journalists who are more interested in seeing the journalist duck for the camera than report on the events that they're seeing. But the difficulty for war reporting is that it is the accessibility to the whole picture, the fact that you're delimited to a very tiny area where you're likely to be filming a load of suffering, and that perceptual awareness reaction to suffering is likely to be what's transmitted to the viewer, rather than the pullback which is required to position that suffering within a wider picture and to explain the nature of what's going on. So there are plenty of journalists who work for the BBC who are proper misery peddlers, who basically go around different parts of the globe, even between wars, wherever there is misery and suffering, and film mothers and children and suffering, and talk about how terrible it is, and try and elicit a reaction of tears or horror from the audience, but without the explanation that explains the cause of one compared with the cause of another, let alone within the context of a war itself and the two sides fighting and the cause behind those, as we've analysed on many of the programmes on this channel. I mean, that's where I was going to start. Certainly. What was your other question?
To what extent, like, what would it do to Israel-UK relations if Israel actually decided to? And I should say, this is not a conversation that's happening in Israel. It's only happening on this channel. The conversation around Al Jazeera happened, and it was pretty much over today when it was decided not to go ahead with.
If you kick the BBC out, they would simply report in exactly the same way from outside of Israel. It would achieve a big fat zero. Essentially, they would spend and they would add to their list of criticisms of Israel the fact that they've been kicked out in the first place. So I think it would be detrimental to Israel's position to do that. But what Israel does need to do is to challenge the BBC reporting and the journalists who ask their questions at every press conference and every time that they have a microphone shoved under the faces of officials. Because and I know that's got some history to it. Obviously, we've seen people like Donald Trump attempt that at press conferences in the past. So it needs to be done in the right way from somebody with some clout and some dignity and some sincerity behind them. But it can't be left. The BBC message is left unchallenged. But kicking them out, I just can't see that would achieve anything. Well, what you need to make sure is that the BBC journalists are also shown the other side. I don't want to match suffering for suffering and saying you should take BBC journalists to show, look at this suffering in Israel. It's because then you're just creating a moral equivalency yourself through that attempt. But you can't just let the line that they take rest as is.
Marco, any thoughts on this?
Well, as you said, Rishi Sunak doesn't interfere on the editorial matters of the BBC, but he's the guy who appoints the Director General. Incidentally, the Director General of the BBC used to be a few years ago Mark Thompson, who came from Channel 4, another lefty outlet here in Britain, who then moved to the Wall Street Journal, I think, or New York Times. And then now is the CEO or president of the CNN. So spot the link there. I don't think there would be a massive diplomatic scandal, to be honest, if that happened. If anything else, the BBC would just pile in against Israel with more righteousness. And I think that would end up there. They already made up their mind, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, Richard, you mentioned the struggles of reporting from war, and John, I have seen very little from U.S. news sources, so maybe you can discuss how it is there. But the fact is, you see the BBC reporting from Gaza. Now, I don't know who these reporters are, but there's no doubt they have to be approved by Hamas. Hamas has to approve what it is that they're reporting, and they have to approve it. Like, somebody from Hamas is watching every single word that is said on the BBC from Gaza and from outside Gaza. And if you're in Gaza and you say something that they don't like, you will no longer, at the very least, you will no longer report from there. If you've ever heard of in any way after that. Yeah, John, I don't know if you actually would have an answer to this, but do you know if Fox News, that's what I'm thinking is, I assume the most pro-Israel of the main news channels, do you know if they have a reporter in Gaza?
No, I don't. I really haven't been watching Fox too much at all. Like I said, I just watch NBC just to get that middle of the road kind of, view. They do use the word terrorists and stuff like that, but I would say their coverage of Gaza suffering is at least 2/3 to the 1/3 Israeli suffering. So it's kind of in the middle. Their language is troublesome, of course, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know about Fox.
Yeah, I mean it's an amazing aspect of this that we have to applaud any news outlet that does us the favor of using the word terrorist when discussing the savages that committed the atrocities on October 7th. It is the world we live in. People here make that demand from the BBC. Nobody's making that demand from, for example, the Guardian, because we already know what side they're on. If they're going to use the word terrorist, it's going to be to describe Israel's attempts to defend itself. Richard, you look like
I would say that the Guardian and the BBC are indistinguishable in terms of editorial outlook. In fact, there are plenty of stories among the BBC mainly by journalists who've left, who tell stories such as they're told by the editorial team, where's the background to this, not to this story before they go on air, and all they're given is a copy of the Guardian article every time. So I think there's very little difference between them, other than the fact that the BBC is obviously funded by everybody in the UK, force funded, whereas the Guardian is voluntary. You don't have to buy it, although many copies are sold to the BBC. Obviously, in the war reporting at the moment, they also use lots of social media stuff, and that's part of the other problem, is that unless you verify or corroborate what you're showing from social media footage, you can't take the full context into account. But they're quite happy to have a double standard, and this is true even when reporting on UK events such as a terrorist attack or a terrorist stabbing or that kind of incident in the UK. You get two types of reporting that follow that almost immediately. Either it's immediately known that there's literature in the perpetrator's home that is far right, and that is in the story from the headline, from the moment it's happened, or there's lots of eyewitness reports of the person shouting Allahu Akbar just before they committed the act, but it's not known what the person is, what their position is, whether they're a terrorist or not, whether they've got mental health issues or not, and that it's ages before anything is corroborated that is really known up front by anybody at the scene and is clearly verifiable. And all of that has led to an absolute drop in faith among the UK population as to how trustworthy the BBC is. So you need only go on Twitter and look at reactions to BBC stories to see how quickly people expose all of those things that are clearly evident within any BBC article. There was one headline the other day on the main page showing something going on in Gaza, showing a scene where there was a collapsed building, there was the kids, the children on the rubble, and there was a baby being held, and even the person holding the baby was cut out of shot, so that the baby was hovering in the corner of the picture like some flying baby, as if the only people who exist in Gaza are children and babies, and not even a baby is carried by a parent. So everything is very much twisted in order to fit the narrative that's predetermined before the story even kicks off, and this is certainly true when it comes to coverage of Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, if you there are on YouTube, you can still find the reporting from September 11, 2001. If you check out the CNN versus the Fox News reporting of the incident as it happened, Fox were already say, well, this has got to be a terrorist attack because blah blah blah, and they gave a good statement. On the CNN, they refused until hours in to even consider it could have been a terrorist incident. And that kind of narrative has been amplified and made worse. On the effectively the right and the left are diverging the way they look at the news. They're so polarized nowadays that that's why you have such a debate between the two factions.
And a clear example of that Mark is referring to, the 9/11, was when the second plane hits the tower, when it's obvious to anybody with a brain that it's a coordinated event. whereas at that point, CNN was still equivocating over what could possibly be the cause, and could there be a airport malfunction and air traffic control and all sorts of any reason rather than the most obvious. But that's 20 years ago. We're some and more. So we're some way on from that, and it's only got worse since.
Yeah. So we don't have any super chats yet. We have a few interesting comments in the chat. There might be more interesting ones. I just haven't read them all. So no offense if I'm not reading your comment. That doesn't mean I don't think it's interesting. Robin said right before the show, should Britain kick BBC reporters out of the country? Laughing emoji. Yes, I will definitely support that policy. Privatize it. If leftists want to pay for left-wing propaganda, then that's fine. I don't, so don't make me pay for it. Thank you, Bet Kali, for your nice comments and compliments. Akira mentions the video of the Israeli. There was an Israeli show called Eretz Nehederet, which is translates to "It's a Wonderful Country." This is a show that's been on for maybe 20 years, maybe more. It's the most popular satire show in Israel, and there's a parody of the BBC. I think it's I agree. I think it's very good. I've also tweeted it or retweeted it, and I think I shared it on some of the members or one of the members groups. If you're a member, it's should be on a WhatsApp group. Yeah, that is hilarious. And when I watched some actual BBC reporting a couple days ago, it was just as bad, if not worse, than the parody. It's shocking the way this channel reports.
Yeah. Can I just ask a
yeah.
second? I don't know whether we should cross-reference or not, but is that the same Akira who asked the question during the Daily Objective about 1930s and whether the UK was heading
Yes,
that way?
that is the only Akira we know who was in the chat.
Fair enough. I wondered if I could chip in on that for
Sure.
one moment. I did hear your answer, and I understand your concerns about living in Britain, etc. But I do think we have to put this a little bit in perspective, because although there are hundreds of thousands, maybe even a few million absolute idiots living in Britain, I still don't think they define what Britain is, and I still think most people are actually on the right side. They may be keeping quiet, and that in itself, as we know from 1930s, etc., it can lead to its own dark results. But I don't think that the level of concern should be exaggerated from that point of view. I mean, you only need hear somebody shout Allahu Akbar on a crowded train to see what people really think. That they're going to be concerned initially for their own safety and their own life, because they associate a phrase like that with the out of context, out of a mosque or whatever, with the possibility that that might be the last thing they hear. So and that is not something that anyone's going to associate with somebody reading from the Torah or whatever. I do think that obviously we've got to keep an absolutely vigilant on this, and we've got to make sure that the police are firm and appropriate. And obviously we're not seeing exactly what we would want to see at this stage, but by any means. But there's a long way between the 1930s, the terrible results than where we are right now. So. I would just wanted to say that for context.
I think. Can you repeat the last point?
Just from my point of view.
Yeah, so I think you're right that these people definitely don't define who Britain is, and maybe a better answer on my part would have been if anything we're closer to maybe 1920s Germany, as in there's a real threat. I think there's a real danger here, and if we don't figure out a way to deal with the danger, certainly if we ignore it, certainly if those in power go out of the way to say, look, this is a part of a legitimate conversation. They have their culture and they have their, then we should respect it. That is how you get towards a point where the threat can manifest itself in scary ways, I think.
Yeah. I'd like to know that when we're walking around, I've been particularly curious to see, just anecdotally, compared with other events, when you look in people's windows, particularly in the areas of East London that we live in or visit or whatever or frequent, to see what's in people's windows, because the kind of people who would have stuck BLM in their window, Ukraine posters in their window on day one of that being the trend, have nothing in their window right now. They don't have Palestinian flags in their window. Now I'm talking about those who are probably well off, but lefty inclined, shall we say?
Guardian readers.
Guardian, yeah, that's a quickest way of describing it to anyone in Britain. Yeah, Guardian readers. So where you're seeing Palestinian flags in windows is in Arabic households. And that's as far as it is, I would say, at the moment, despite the fact that, as you can clearly see on protests, that there are people who support the pro-Palestinian, whatever you want to call it, anti-Israel cause on a march. But that is somewhat different, I think. And because you see them gathered in one spot, that always gives a bit of a misleading impression.
Yeah, I mean, I think also maybe for some of these people, the memories of October 7th are still fresh enough that as Israel is more and more portrayed as the aggressor and the bad guy in this, you might see more of those flags, but we'll see. You mentioned the way they like cut out of a picture just the baby, or I think we spoke yesterday about the CNN video of somebody of like body bags, and one of the people in the body bags like moved their head. They weren't told that they are live on CNN. This is what they call Pallywood, which is the Palestinian way of orchestrating the kind of images that Western media buys into without question, and then promotes to the world, and does that knowing, I'm sure, that much of this is fake, it's orchestrated, and knowing what the result would be in the way people react to it in Western countries, and doing it because of that. We mentioned the Guardian. The Guardian yesterday, when Israel managed to free one of the hostages in a military operation, at some point early on, said a hostage has been released. I mean, I've asked in the past, to what extent the Guardian actually thinks their readers are idiots. Because if somebody, whatever issue you agree with the Guardian on, you have to be insulted by the way they report it. John, is the whole Pallywood thing being discussed in America? Is anybody saying, look, so much of this is bullshit that's being pushed at us? Knowing that it's not what it claims to be?
The only thing I hear questioning of by the media is of anything the US or Israel says, but it just seems like anything the Hamas side says is just believed out of hand, as if they're not even capable of lying. It's mind-bogglingly disgusting. Even on the middle of the road type NBC News or whatever, they have that same kind of undertone. Took them days to believe that the hospital bombing wasn't actually true, without bringing up some doubt of Israel because they lied once about something a long time ago. Meanwhile, Hamas generates this propaganda constantly, and And you can even, it's obvious. It's disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, the hospital bombing thing should have been a turning point. If any of them were honestly mistaken in all their buying into Hamas's bullshit, and of course, you can't be honestly mistaken. I'm going to take that back. You can't be honestly mistaken when you know these are the people who committed the atrocities on October 7th.
Well, I think it was partly because they know that the anti-Israel sentiment doubled and tripled after the initial hospital bombing because of their reporting and how they immediately bought the Hamas in line. So they couldn't admit that they automatically knew, because then they'd have to admit that they jumped on the wrong wagon way too quick.
And also the amount of mental evasion that seems to occur on the side of Hamas. Like, hang on a second, we are providing all this support, so-called humanitarian support to them, and why is it that they still live in the most abject poverty ever? All these miles and miles of tunnel under the towns. How do they come from? Have they got a massive worm that makes its way under the ground in Gaza? The press doesn't seem to question even the most obvious fact, like the hospital, for example. How is it that when you hit a car park, the whole thing blows up? Nobody questions that. It's total mental apathy and evasion. They just don't even, they can't even get themselves to question the facts. And we should be really the basis of journalism, isn't it? You see something, you verify, and then you talk about it. No, the left, mainly the left, they just see something and they just make it as an example of the kind of narrative that they're pushing. Oh, look at this evil Israeli are attacking the hospital.
And when some fact goes against that narrative, you can see how uncomfortable and shifty they are about coming round to that opinion, and you can see how much they dislike the fact that the narrative is being undeniably exposed for being the exact opposite of what they've peddled. That, combined with the fact that all of their history of how they report on other issues plays into these things. So, for example, when they're talking about hospital services generally in Gaza, and they're using phrases like the hospital services are suffering from a catastrophic collapse, that's the same phrase they'll use about the UK every winter when talking about the NHS. So even the phrase becomes degraded by the ludicrous hyperbole that's used in a totally different context. Never mind when we then look at Gaza, what the causes of that are, being a different matter entirely.
Yeah, I mean, and post the Gaza hospital incident and the reporting of it, you would think some things would change, and in some places I do see they report something and then they say the health ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, but very rarely. And you see that about specific things. You don't see that about there are many things on which numbers are reported around the war, numbers from Gaza, the number of people who live there, which is supposedly 2 million. The number of dead, which I make a point of not mentioning the number of dead on the Palestinian side because we don't know it. What we know is that the number we hear is a lie. But this is something that is reported daily in the news. The fact that 50% of people in the Gaza Strip are children, the number of children among the dead, all sorts of supposed facts that in countries, in Western countries, as much as here on this show and on this channel, we oppose a lot of the way the systems operate. Generally speaking, when you get numbers, they are correct, and if not, it is a type of scandal when they're not correct. So again, numbers from Gaza are being reported by news outlets without question. I've seen this on Israeli news channels as well, and yeah, it makes you really wonder. It makes you wonder how we can trust news sources on anything, because if they get their information on what goes on in Gaza from Hamas, where do they get their information about anything else that happens anywhere else, John?
Uh, college professors, I don't know. The I have to, I don't know. It's mind-boggling where they think their objectivity is. It's non-existent. I don't know. I don't even know what to say about that.
Richard?
Yeah, well, who knows? But I think one of the interesting examples of what they're having to report on at the moment, where they're extra uncomfortable about, is when looking at the Labour Party and the left and their own the turmoils within the Labour Party at the moment, where Keir Starmer, the leader of the left-wing Labour Party, is trying to keep together a coalition of MPs who wish to break from his current policy of regarding Gaza and saying Israel has the right to defend itself, where some of his Muslim MPs, etc., and councillors have been resigning because they want the policy to become that a ceasefire should be announced immediately. Now, that's a case where the BBC would much rather have a Labour government, because the Labour government is going to be much kinder to the BBC in terms of its funding and its expansion and all the rest of it. So the BBC will always be leaning towards the Labour Party and covering up its mistakes where possible and exposing the Tories more where possible with that aim in mind. And at the moment, you're definitely seeing that. They are covering this story, which means it is significant and bigger than they want it to be, and they're forced to cover it. But they're also downplaying it significantly. And I think it's going to be interesting to see whether either the Labour Party or the BBC or both can keep a lid on that story long enough for it not to become a major impact at the ballot box come next year.
And going back to the reliability of numbers of casualties, to be honest, it's not here nor there. Any casualty on the Gaza side has to be added to the 1,400 victims in Israel, because they are caused by the same people. So 20, 2,000, 5 million, doesn't matter. It's going to be caused by just one side. If Hamas didn't behave like the beasts that they are, all this will not happen. So there's no even point debating whether the numbers are correct or not. Just casting your mind back, look, what was the message that came out from 9/11 over 20 years ago? Oh, don't blame the Muslims, don't be Islamophobic. And now the thing has totally changed. It's like, yeah, it's Israel's fault, is it? Okay. It's the Jews, is it? Okay. I mean, it's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, I mean, it was days after 9/11 that George W. Bush called Islam a religion of peace. What you didn't see much of is mass protests in support of Al Qaeda. So, this is something that is unique to any time that the Jewish state fights. Yeah, well, I wanted to touch on another point. So yeah, I mean, the turmoil within the Labor Party is interesting to see. We've had our disagreements about the Labor Party. I'm not a fan, in case people got that mistaken impression on this channel. I do think Keir Starmer is not as bad as Jeremy Corbyn, which is, of course, is not saying much about anybody. It's not much of a compliment if somebody says to you, well, you're not as bad as Jeremy Corbyn. I think he tried to get rid of some of the anti-Semites in his party, and we see how Marco is disagreeing, but we see whether or not that is the case. We see it didn't really work out so far. I mean, he's in trouble because he's not siding with Hamas strongly enough. But no, actually, I don't think he's siding with Hamas. Let me clarify that statement. I think he is, again, better than I would expect somebody who is the leader of the party, whose previous leader was Jeremy Corbyn. I think, yeah, we need to think about it in context. As I say about Biden, when I say, he's relatively good on this, it is with the context of what other options are there. The Conservative Party had somebody, let me see, Paul Bristow, a member of parliament from the Conservative Party, was fired from his role, private secretary. He was a parliamentary private secretary at the Department for Science, which is Sky News calls it one of the most junior roles in government, and is often described as a bag carrier for the more senior ministers. But there's a something in this in his open letter to the prime minister, which is telling. I guess this guy gets his news from the BBC, because he said thousands have been killed and more than 1 million are now displaced. It is difficult to understand how this makes Israel more secure, or indeed makes anything better. I mean, this is something I see from the left a lot. They're war on reality is often much more blatant. They'll look at something and they'll say it isn't there. So if you look at the images from October 7th, and then you look at Israel trying to kill some of the people who are behind that, some of the people who are trying to keep the rockets coming, and those people end up hiding, choose to hide behind civilians, so civilians die as well. Is it not clear that when a bunch of people, when 10,000 people come at you with the intention of killing you, and you kill some of them, you are more secure than if all 10,000 are alive? I mean, I think all Israel, all the people who want to kill Jews in Israel are should be killed by Israel. I wouldn't even say preemptively, because they've already done their thing. But yeah, it's amazing to hear that. And again, this is a conservative MP. We talk about how the conservatives are, this is why I've been accused, I think, of being a Labor supporter, is because I have said how the conservatives on so many economic issues in government have governed to the left of Tony Blair, the prime minister before last from Labour Party. And yeah, even on this, where Britain is not great, but not completely terrible compared to other countries, within the Conservative Party, there are still people who side with Hamas, however they might put it.
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the most depressing elements of the BBC is the fact that it still holds a disturbing amount of clout with the British people, particularly those who are the older batch of British people, or the more conservative-minded, conservative with a small c. I mean, you only need to mention the word Amazon to people, and people will say lots of bile about Amazon, because the BBC will frequently do stories about what a terrible company Amazon is and how dreadfully it treats its employees, mainly because the BBC would much prefer that companies like Amazon didn't exist, and people didn't have access to whatever book they wanted that sold any message they wanted, including all those books on the poster behind you, Razi, which wouldn't be available in a bookshop, but would only be available via Amazon. So it's in the BBC's interest to make sure that lots of literature is unavailable. But with Amazon as an example of how much what I consider to be normal, rational people suddenly spout the line of the BBC and rant as if they've been trained somewhere as to what to say, when I consider them normal. And when you drill down into it, it's because they read a BBC article or saw something on the BBC, and it's defined their view of the world through the drip effect of all the radio stations, channels that the BBC has at its disposal.
You notice too, I just wanted to mention the double standard. Well, another example of the double standard they apply to Israel. You mentioned that he was criticizing Israel and the fact that how is this offensive going to make things better for Israel, or I can't remember exactly the words he used, but well, you notice that logic is never applied to Hamas. How is the actions of October 7th making them a more free people? What and you can go on with more questions like that. Why are the soldiers hiding in the tunnels instead of putting those 1 million supposed children down there and hiding them down there like any sane, rational person would do? No, it's never those questions. It's always what Israel's problem is, or how they're not going to solve this by doing it this way. Well, they've been trying to do it your way for 50, 60 years, and look at what's happened. It gets worse. Now it needs to end before these savages get a nuclear weapon, or we're all screwed.
So his exact words were, it is difficult to understand how this makes Israel more secure or indeed makes anything better. And
Yeah.
yeah.
And I just turn that right around on Hamas, and how is their actions making Palestine any more free or secure from Israel?
But well, if we're going to take something positive out of this, he was fired from his non-job. John, is there a chance that Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar will also get fired by their party?
That'd be really nice. I've seen comments online of Democrats that are saying things like, I've been a lifelong Democrat, but this can't stand, or I'm not going to be a Democrat anymore. So there is going to be some backlash, but I don't think much will come of it. At best, I hope either of them will get reelected, but judging from the marches in Michigan and everything, I think that's not going to happen. And until the U.S. declares war on somebody, either Iran or just militant Islam or something, then we can't just kick her out. I don't know the actual laws or whatever, but the conservatives complaining about, us not doing anything about it, well, then get them to declare war on who needs to be fought. And we can do all that stuff.
By the way, maybe I should have mentioned this before, but it just occurred to me, it is the last day of the month. So thank you for the super chatters. I'm going to read the super chats in a minute. Anybody who wants to send us, this is the last opportunity to send a super chat this month, which will then we will get the money next month. And considering that we have not done much of what we usually do to increase our income, that will be particularly helpful. So any super chats are especially welcome in the next 5 minutes or so that we have left on the show. Jeff Bannister says, Fox News is the only one I can watch, although the opinion shows are angled to anything we can use against Biden or what Trump would have done better. Yeah, I mean, after 9/11, when they started broadcasting Fox News in Israel, I used to watch Fox News, and then there was there was some it was the second Intifada, so yeah, Fox News was better on that than any of the Israeli news channels. They were more pro-Israel than the Israeli news channels. There's a lot that was wrong with them now that or back then that I saw back then. There was more in what they did back then that I see as wrong now. Then again, that is where I first saw Jonathan Hoenig and watched him on a weekly basis on Saturdays in Cashing In. And it took a while before I even knew he's an objectivist. I just saw him and thought, okay, this is a guy who makes sense there. Lee sends a super chat. He says, what are your thoughts on the term Islamism and why do you think it's used? I'll start with the second part of that, and then I'll go to everyone else for the first part. I think it's used because people want to be careful to not say or not be accused of having said that we're blaming all Muslims. And I used to have I think more of an issue with it than I have now. I used to say consistent Muslims was a thing I like to say, to troll all religious people kind of in one go by saying, yeah, the people you see are following Islam consistently. I'm very glad that many people are not following it consistently, but yeah, any thoughts on the term Islamism from anyone else on the panel? Yeah.
Sorry. As you said, I mean, it's just used as euphemism to not to say Muslim. I mean, after all, any normal person, even people who believe in the ghost of Islam, if they actually read the Quran and they read the terrible, awful passages that are included in the book, they will probably disagree on it. They will never say, "Well, yeah, I believe that." In the same way that Christians, if they properly read the Bible, will probably frown on it. They probably distance themselves from it. So, if you try to come up with a word that doesn't cover what the real issue is, well, then all the best, isn't it? After all, we live in a world where moral compass is not even there, where people appease people, we see all the time. That's why this Tory guy is effectively just represent the world out there, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you used to see the term Islamist extremist with the extremist added to it as well for a double protection against being called Islamophobic or any such nonsense. So yeah, they're all forms of caveat and shuffle and hide. So yeah, it's But as I said, the people on the bus who hear the words Allahu Akbar shouted loudly know exactly what the difference is, and they don't need to look it up in a dictionary or check what term should be used before they start running.
John, your thoughts on the term Islamism?
I actually think the term makes sense because Islam is what I have a problem with, not individual Muslims, and I don't want people to confuse. It's just quick and concise compared to saying Muslim, in my opinion. It's like when I say Jew, I don't hold all Jews. When you say Jew, it includes the cultural and the people that were just raised Jewish, just like I could be considered Christian, even though I'm not now an atheist. I was raised Christian. So I can see being called a Christian, but I'm definitely not a fundamentalist Christian or something more extreme at all. I'm not Christian at all. But my point is, it's quicker, in my opinion, to get right to the point of the problem, the fundamental problem. So I don't know. I don't mind it. But I can see why it's used to, or how it is used to whitewash apathy towards the cult that is Islam, or any of the three religions, really.
But certainly tracing the use of language in terms like that over time is particularly interesting in showing the trend of a culture towards what it permits itself to say or doesn't, and how it tries to find new ways, and how some things come in almost by invisible diktat from who knows where that becomes the new accepted way of saying something.
I think it's a great injustice to lump together someone who was merely raised Muslim with someone who is actually an Islamist, currently out there killing people. So that's why I guess I choose to.
So before we sign off, I want to thank Bonnie for the super chat. Thank you, Roland, for the super chat. Roland says, "Happy Halloween." Happy Halloween to you too. Christopher and Ashley Shrug, thank you both for the super chats. Oh, yeah. And Akira says Razi is a New Labour fan. I'm not a New Labour fan. I'm not a fan of anybody in politics, by the way. But if you want to find somebody in British politics that I'm less not a fan of than others, it would be Margaret Thatcher, not New Labour. Yeah, I'm just a harsh critic of the Conservative Party that has raised taxes, invented taxes on new things, put us all in a in a prison basically, yeah. So I think they deserve our hatred. That doesn't mean that the alternative is superior. It certainly isn't. But anyway, hopefully between now and the general election in the UK, Israel will have won the war and we can go back to talking about other topics. I do look forward to having, this will be the first general election in the UK where ARCUK is on YouTube regularly. We had a YouTube channel in 2019, but we used it only for, live streaming of events. And yeah, we will have some sort of election coverage, hopefully, when that happens. We will it's going to be a sad day no matter what, because some bad guy will become or remain prime minister. But anyway, the Fountainhead Book Club for ARCUK members of all levels begins in 3 minutes. This is one of those times where it's not going to start late because of the reality show. So you're welcome. And we will be back here tomorrow for the Daily Objective, the reality show, and HBTV. HBTV is tomorrow at 9. The title is Lethal Language Against Israel. I will be joining Harry for that show. If you have a question or comment that you want read out on the show, you can super chat that preemptively. We're fans of preemptive acts here on the channel. It has to be a £20 or more super chat for that show. It's not a Ask Harry Anything episode. It is an episode where Harry will tell you what he thinks, whether you ask him or not. But yeah, for super chats, please do keep it to £20 or more if you want them read and answered. Thank you, everybody. See you back here tomorrow.